People often say the hardest part of growing old is watching your body slow down. For me, it wasn't my back, my hands, or the gray in my hair. Lie. It was the day my own son looked at me across the conference table in the shop I'd spent 40 years building and quietly said, "Dad, it's time for you to step away. We don't need you anymore." I wish I could tell you those words made me angry. They didn't. They made me wonder if I'd spent my entire life confusing sacrifice with love. For weeks, I packed away old tools, avoided familiar streets, and tried to convince myself that maybe this was simply what getting older looked like. Look, maybe every father reaches a day when the family he built no longer has room for him. Then an attorney called and told me my late wife had left strict instructions that a sealed letter be delivered only if our family ever allowed money to become more important than each other. I hadn't seen Grace's handwriting in 7 years. I had no idea that one envelope would force every one of us to face truths we'd spent decades avoiding. I thought I was about to read my wife's final goodbye. Instead, it became the beginning of the hardest and most important conversation our family had ever had. Looking back now, I realize none of it began on the day Daniel told me I wasn't needed anymore. It began years earlier, hidden inside ordinary mornings that seemed too simple to matter. Life has a quiet way of warning us before it changes. Most of us are just too busy living to notice. For 40 years, my mornings started before sunrise. Even after I stopped setting an alarm, my eyes opened at 5:30 almost every day. Habit is a stubborn thing. I would pull on the same faded work shirt, lace up my old boots, and make a pot of coffee before the rest of the town was awake. Some people retire and immediately begin sleeping in, late high. I tried that once. I lasted 2 days before I found myself standing in the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, staring out the window and wondering what I was supposed to do with all the hours I'd spent earning. The woodworking shop sat only 15 minutes from my house, tucked beside an old railroad line that hadn't carried passengers in years. The trains still rolled through now and then, mostly freight cars, and every time I heard them, I remembered the day we first unlocked the front door. Back then, the building wasn't much to look at. The roof leaked whenever it rained, the floors were uneven, and every wall seemed to have a crack that let winter air sneak inside. Grace looked around that empty building, smiled at me, and said, "I think this place has good bones." She had a gift for seeing what something could become instead of what it was. We didn't have much money in those days. The down payment had emptied our savings account, and for nearly a year we counted every dollar before spending it. There were nights when dinner was little more than soup and bread, but Grace never complained. She always reminded me that we weren't building furniture, we were building a future. I believed her because she believed it first. Even now, decades later, I could still remember every corner of that shop without closing my eyes. The smell of fresh-cut oak, the soft hum of the dust collector, lava. The way morning sunlight slipped through the east windows and landed across the workbenches before anyone else arrived. Customers often told me they loved walking through the front door because the place felt peaceful. They thought it was the wood. I always knew it was the people. Grace used to bring lunch every Friday afternoon. She'd walk in carrying a picnic basket that was older than our marriage, and somehow she'd convince every employee to stop working long enough to eat together. Looking back, I think she understood something I didn't. Businesses survive because of numbers, but families survive because people keep choosing one another. After Grace passed away 7 years earlier, Fridays became the hardest day of the week. I still found myself glancing toward the front door around noon, expecting to see her smile before reality quietly corrected me again. Grief doesn't disappear. It simply learns to sit beside you without speaking quite as often. Daniel started working in the shop when he was 16. I still remember how proud he looked, carrying his first toolbox through the front door. He wanted to prove he could earn his place instead of receiving special treatment because he was the owner's son. I admired that. I made sure he swept floors before he ever touched expensive lumber, and he never complained. Customers watched him grow from a nervous teenager into a capable craftsman, and I honestly believed one day he'd become a better businessman than I ever was. In many ways, he did. Daniel understood computers, online orders, and marketing strategies that sounded like another language to me. He modernized our bookkeeping, redesigned the website, and found new customers in places I'd never thought to look. Sales improved every year after he took over more responsibility, and I was proud to tell anyone who asked that the future of Bennett Woodworks was in good hands. At least that's what I believed. The first small changes didn't seem important enough to question. Meetings were moved to times when no one bothered telling me. Suppliers started calling Daniel instead of me. New equipment arrived without anyone asking for my opinion. Lee. I told myself that was how succession worked. Every father eventually has to loosen his grip if he wants his children to grow. Still, there were moments that stayed with me longer than they should have. One afternoon, a customer I'd worked with for nearly 20 years walked into the showroom asking if I could help design a dining table for his daughter's wedding. Before I had a chance to answer, Daniel stepped between us with a polite smile. "Dad's taking it easy these days," he said. "I'll take care of everything." His words weren't rude. In fact, most people standing nearby probably thought they sounded thoughtful. But I noticed the customer hesitate before looking back at me. He wasn't asking because he needed the owner. He was asking because we'd built trust over 2 decades, one conversation at a time. I smiled anyway. "You're in good hands," I said. The customer nodded, and Daniel led him toward his office. I watched them disappear down the hallway, telling myself it was exactly the future I'd worked for. Yet as I stood there with my hands resting on the worn handle of my old carpenter's hammer, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that I had just become a visitor inside the life I had spent 40 years building. Like for the next few weeks, I kept telling myself that I was imagining things. After all, Daniel wasn't a bad son. He called every Sunday, checked in whenever I had one of my doctor's appointments, and never forgot my birthday. If someone had asked me whether he loved me, I would have answered yes without hesitation. That was what made the changes so difficult to understand. They didn't arrive as arguments or cruel words. They arrived quietly, hidden inside small decisions that seemed harmless on their own, but painful when they began to add up. Every morning, I still drove to the shop before most of the employees arrived. Old habits don't disappear just because someone writes the word retired on a piece of paper. I'd unlock the front door, switch on the lights, and walk slowly through the building, running my hand along workbenches that had been with me longer than some of the people working there. The smell of freshly cut maple and walnut still settled my mind the way it always had. For a little while, before everyone else arrived, it still felt like home. Why? Around 8 o'clock, the crew would begin filtering in. Most of them had worked with me for years, and they greeted me exactly the same way they always had. Mike, our foreman, never started his coffee before asking if I wanted a cup. Luis always wanted to know whether I'd caught the baseball game the night before. Even the younger employees, who barely remembered the early days of the business, treated me with the kind of respect that comes from hearing old stories often enough to believe they matter. Those conversations became the best part of my day. I noticed, though, that Daniel was usually already inside his office before anyone else arrived. His door stayed closed more often than it used to, and meetings seemed to happen behind that door without me ever hearing about them. Whenever I walked past, I'd hear voices discussing new suppliers, expansion plans, or marketing ideas. Lie. Sometimes I'd catch my own name, followed by a silence that lasted just a little too long. I never stopped to listen. If my son wanted privacy, I was going to give it to him. One Tuesday morning, Mike found me tightening a loose cabinet hinge in the showroom. He leaned against the counter and watched me work for a moment before speaking. "You know," he said, "nobody fixes things as neatly as you do." I smiled without looking up. "That's because I learned from making every mistake a man could make." He laughed, but it faded quickly. "We've got a big custom hotel project starting next month. That's good news." "It is," he hesitated. "I figured you'd be leading it." I looked over at him. So did I. Neither of us said anything after that. There wasn't much to say. Mike wasn't asking for answers. He was trying to understand something neither of us could quite explain. That afternoon, I wandered into the finishing room where several dining tables were lined up waiting for stain. I had built enough furniture over the years to recognize quality before touching the wood. Daniel had assembled a talented team. Their joints were tight, their measurements were precise, and every surface had been sanded with care. Pride washed over me as I walked through the room. The business wasn't declining. In fact, it was probably stronger than it had ever been. So why did I feel like something important was slipping away? When Grace was alive, she always seemed to notice things before anyone else did. She had a quiet way of paying attention that made people feel seen without realizing they were being observed. Whenever I came home frustrated after a difficult day, she'd pour 2 cups of coffee, sit across from me at our kitchen table, and wait. She almost never interrupted. Somehow, by the time I'd finished talking, I'd usually discovered the answer myself. Like am I. There were evenings when she warned me that success could become dangerous if we ever started measuring people by what they produced instead of who they were. I hadn't thought about those conversations in years. Standing alone in the finishing room, those memories returned with surprising clarity. I could almost hear her voice asking the same simple question she always asked whenever I complained about work. What matters most here, Tom? Back then, my answer had always been easy. The people. I wondered if I still believed that. A few days later, Daniel asked me to join him for lunch. We drove to a small diner we'd been visiting since he was a teenager. The waitress recognized us immediately and brought 2 coffees before we'd even opened the menus. It felt comforting, almost normal. And for the first 20 minutes, we talked about ordinary things. He asked how my vegetable garden was doing, and I teased him about never finding time to mow his own lawn. We laughed together more than once. I found myself thinking that maybe I'd been worrying over nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair and glanced toward the window. Dad, he said carefully, I've been thinking a lot about the future. I have too. The company's growing faster than I expected. I know, you've done a good job. He thanked me, but his smile didn't last. The truth is, we're changing how we operate. I waited. We're bringing in consultants. They're helping us streamline management and define everyone's responsibilities. There was nothing unusual about that. Businesses grow, they adapt.
So?
They think it'll be easier if customers start seeing me as the primary face of the company. I stirred my coffee without taking a sip. I figured that was already happening. It is. He looked uncomfortable now, tapping one finger against the edge of the table. It's mine. They also think it might send mixed signals if you're still involved in day-to-day decisions. I studied my son's face. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He genuinely believed he was explaining something reasonable. I haven't made many day-to-day decisions lately. I know. So what exactly are you asking? His eyes dropped to his coffee cup. I just think maybe it's time you came in less often. The words settled between us like dust after a board had been cut. They weren't shouted. They weren't cruel. In another family, they might even have sounded practical. But sitting across from my only son, inside the diner where we'd celebrated birthdays, graduations, and our biggest business milestones, they carried a weight neither of us seemed prepared to lift. I forced a small smile because I didn't want him to see how deeply they landed. I said quietly. Daniel nodded with visible relief, as if we'd successfully solved a difficult business problem. We paid the bill, walked back to our trucks, hugged goodbye, just like we always did. Yet as I drove home with the windows down and the afternoon sun warming my left arm, I couldn't escape the feeling that something had shifted in a way neither of us fully understood. Spy. For the first time since opening Bennett Woodworks 40 years earlier, I wasn't wondering how to build the future. I was wondering whether there was still a place for me in it. The conversation at the diner stayed with me much longer than I wanted to admit. I replayed Daniel's words over and over during the drive home, trying to hear them the way he probably intended instead of the way they landed in my heart. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused me of doing anything wrong. If anything, he'd sounded nervous, as though he knew the conversation might hurt. That should have comforted me, but somehow it made it worse. It meant he understood there was pain involved, yet he believed the decision was necessary anyway. The following Monday, I almost turned my truck around before reaching the shop. My hands rested on the steering wheel while I sat at a red light only 3 blocks away, wondering if Daniel would prefer that I simply stay home. Pride told me to head back to the house. Habit told me to keep driving. Habit won, just as it had every morning for 40 years. When I walked through the front door, the familiar scent of fresh-cut cherry wood greeted me like an old friend. Mike was already unloading lumber near the loading dock, and he waved the moment he saw me. "Morning, Tom." "Morning. You get any fishing in over the weekend?" I chuckled. "Bought the license 3 months ago and still haven't managed to wet a line. That's because you keep coming here." "I guess you're right." He smiled and went back to work, but his words lingered. He hadn't meant anything by them. Neither had Daniel, probably. Both reminders pointed toward the same uncomfortable truth. Everyone around me seemed to assume I was supposed to be somewhere else. I spent the morning doing little jobs that didn't really need to be done. I adjusted cabinet doors in the showroom, sharpened a handful of chisels that still cut just fine, and reorganized a drawer full of hardware that nobody had complained about. They were the kinds of tasks a man invents when he wants to feel useful without getting in anyone's way. Around lunchtime, I noticed several unfamiliar cars parked outside. Men and women in business clothes stepped into the conference room carrying laptops and thick folders. Daniel greeted them with a confident handshake before closing the glass door behind them. I wasn't invited. That wasn't unusual anymore. But something about seeing strangers discussing the future of a company I'd built from an empty warehouse made my chest feel unexpectedly heavy. I walked toward the break room instead, poured myself another cup of coffee, and stared out the window overlooking the workshop floor. Years ago, Grace used to joke that coffee solved half the world's problems simply because it forced people to sit still long enough to think. I smiled at the memory before realizing that, for the first time, I didn't know what I was supposed to think. About an hour later, Emily stopped by the shop. She wasn't there for business. She often dropped off lunch for Daniel whenever he forgot to eat, which happened more often than she'd admit. She spotted me sitting alone at one of the workbenches and walked over with the same warm smile she'd worn since the day Daniel first introduced us. "There you are," she said. "I was beginning to think you'd finally taken retirement seriously." Lie. "I've been pretending." She laughed softly before setting a small paper bag on the bench. "I brought too much soup. Thought you might help me solve the problem." I've never been one to turn down homemade soup. We sat together in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Emily had always been good at that. Some people feel obligated to fill every quiet moment with conversation. She understood that silence could be its own kind of kindness. Finally, she glanced toward the conference room. "They've been in there all morning, so I noticed. Daniel's been stressed lately. I know. He wants everything to be perfect." I nodded slowly. He always did. Lee. Emily looked as though she wanted to say something else, but instead she lowered her eyes to her coffee cup. "I think he's carrying more pressure than he lets people see. I don't doubt that. And sometimes," she hesitated, "sometimes people trying to prove themselves don't realize who they're pushing aside." Those words caught me off guard. I looked at her carefully. "Has he said something?" She shook her head almost immediately. "No, I noticed things." For a brief moment, I thought about telling her everything Daniel had said at the diner. I wanted someone to reassure me that I wasn't imagining the distance growing between us. But Emily was caught in the middle already. She loved my son, and she'd always treated me like family. I wasn't going to ask her to choose sides over a conversation that still might turn out to mean less than I feared. "It's growing pains," I said, offering a smile that felt more convincing than it actually was. "Lynn, every business goes through them." She smiled back, though I wasn't sure either of us believed it. That Friday afternoon, the entire staff gathered in the workshop for what Daniel described as an important company update. We had done this many times over the years whenever we landed a major contract or celebrated another successful season. Employees stood around workbenches with coffee cups in hand, while Daniel connected his laptop to a large television mounted on the wall. He looked confident, professional, exactly the kind of leader I'd hoped he'd become. He spoke about record sales, expanding into commercial projects, and investing in new equipment that would help the company grow for another generation. Everyone applauded when he announced a large contract to furnish a new boutique hotel. Watching the employees smile with genuine excitement filled me with pride. They deserved every bit of that success. Then Daniel clicked to the next slide. The screen displayed a new organizational chart. My name wasn't where it had always been. In fact, it wasn't near the top at all. Under founder, there was a small line that read asterisk honorary advisor. Below it, another line. Asterisk no operational responsibilities. I stared at the screen, convinced I had misunderstood it. Daniel continued speaking as though nothing unusual had happened. "As we continue modernizing the company," he said, "Lee, it's important that everyone understands reporting structures. Questions about scheduling, purchasing, production, or customer approvals should now come directly to department managers." Several employees glanced toward me before quickly looking away. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the workshop seemed quieter than usual. Daniel finally looked in my direction. He smiled politely, the way a man smiles after believing he's handled a difficult situation with care. "Dad," he said, "Look, would you mind joining me in the conference room for a minute?" Every eye in the building followed us as we walked across the shop floor. The conference room felt strangely smaller than it ever had before. Through the glass walls, I could still see employees pretending to return to work while doing everything they could not to look inside. Daniel closed the door gently. I should have explained this earlier. I waited. He folded his hands together, searching for the right words. "The consultants think it's important that everyone understands who's making decisions now." I nodded once. "I gathered that. This isn't personal. Those 4 words have probably started more painful conversations than any others in the English language. He took a slow breath before continuing. Dad, it's time for you to step away. The room fell completely silent. Then he looked at me with a mixture of guilt and determination and quietly said the words that would follow me long after that afternoon was over. We don't need you anymore. For a moment, I honestly believed I'd misheard him. My ears were still working just fine, but the human heart has a remarkable way of rejecting words it isn't ready to accept. I looked at Daniel, hoping he'd smile and tell me he'd chosen the wrong phrase. Instead, lead. He stood there with his shoulders squared, trying to convince himself that what he had just said was the right thing for the business. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't trying to hurt me, but he had already convinced himself that hurting me was simply part of moving the company forward. I took a slow breath and rested my hands on the back of one of the conference room chairs. The wood felt cool beneath my fingers. For a strange second, I wondered if I'd built that chair myself years earlier. I see, I said quietly. My voice surprised even me. It didn't shake. It didn't rise. Why? It sounded like the voice of a man discussing tomorrow's weather instead of hearing his life's purpose quietly taken away. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck before speaking again. Dad, please don't think this changes how much I appreciate everything you've done. None of this would exist without you. I managed a small smile. I know, but the company's different now. Clients expect faster decisions. Investors want a clear leadership structure. The consultants all agreed that having 2 generations making decisions creates confusion. I haven't been making many decisions, I know. Then why does this feel like I'm being fired? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Most of my. Daniel looked down at the floor. I'm not firing you. It feels that way. He didn't answer because there wasn't an answer that could make those words sound any kinder. Silence settled between us again, heavier than before. Through the glass wall, I could see employees pretending to stay busy while occasionally glancing toward the conference room. They weren't curious about business strategy anymore. They were worried about me. After a long moment, Daniel reached into a folder lying on the table. I put together a retirement recognition package. He slid it across to me. Inside was a leather folder, a framed certificate thanking me for 40 years of leadership, and information about a monthly retirement stipend the company had voted to provide. Everything was neatly organized, professionally prepared, and obviously created with care. I stared at the certificate for several seconds. My name was written in elegant gold lettering beneath the words, "With deep appreciation." Funny how appreciation can sometimes feel like a goodbye. I thought you'd like this, Daniel said softly. I closed the folder and handed it back. I think you should keep it here for now. His eyebrows lifted slightly. You don't want it? I'll take it another day. The truth was simpler than that. I wasn't ready to carry proof that my working life had officially become part of the past. When I stepped out of the conference room, conversations stopped almost immediately. The shop wasn't silent, but it had become unusually careful. Mike looked up from a workbench before quickly lowering his eyes. Luis paused in the middle of measuring a cabinet door. Even the younger employees, who probably didn't know exactly what had happened, sensed that something important had changed. I walked through the workshop at my usual pace, refusing to hurry toward the exit. Every machine, every shelf, every workbench carried memories that had accumulated over 4 decades. There was the planer we'd bought after our first profitable year. The sanding station Daniel had helped me assemble during one summer break from college. The old bulletin board where Grace used to pin birthday cards for every employee. Nothing in the building had changed, only my place inside it. As I reached my workbench near the back wall, I noticed my old carpenter's hammer resting exactly where I'd left it that morning. The handle had grown smooth from decades of use. Tiny scratches covered the steel head like wrinkles on an old face. Grace used to tease me because I refused to replace it. You know they make new hammers every year, she'd say. I know, so why keep this one? Because this one's learned alongside me, Lee. She always laughed at that answer. I picked up the hammer, turning it slowly in my hands before placing it into the worn leather toolbox I'd carried for most of my career. One by one, I packed away the measuring tape, my favorite chisel, a block plane, and a pencil that had been sharpened so many times it barely fit between my fingers anymore. Mike quietly walked over. I think so. You heading out early? He nodded once. If you need anything. I know. He looked as though he wanted to say more, but neither of us could find words that would improve the situation. Instead, he reached out and squeezed my shoulder before returning to work. It was a simple gesture, but sometimes kindness doesn't need a speech. Driving home that afternoon felt strangely unfamiliar, even though I'd taken the same road thousands of times. Usually my mind stayed occupied with customer orders, lumber deliveries, or ideas for new furniture designs. That day, there was only silence. Past the hardware store where Grace and I had bought supplies during our first renovation. I drove past the little diner where Daniel had proudly announced his first big commercial contract a few years earlier. Every familiar place seemed determined to remind me that life keeps moving whether we're ready or not. When I reached home, the house felt larger than usual. Grace had been gone for 7 years, yet some afternoons I still expected to hear music playing softly from the kitchen or catch the smell of fresh bread drifting through the hallway. Grief had changed over time. It no longer knocked me to the floor, but it had never truly left. It simply waited quietly in familiar rooms. I set my toolbox beside the front door and wandered into the living room. Above the fireplace stood the photograph taken on the day Bennett Woodworks officially opened. Grace stood beside me wearing a denim jacket with sawdust on one sleeve because she'd spent the morning helping clean the building before the ribbon cutting. Daniel, only 9 years old then, grinned proudly while holding the oversized ceremonial scissors the mayor had let him borrow. We looked like a family that believed anything was possible. Maybe we were. That evening, I skipped dinner and settled into the old recliner. Grace had insisted we buy after my back surgery years earlier. I wasn't hungry. Instead, I found myself staring at the family photograph until darkness slowly filled the room. The ringing of the telephone startled me. Hardly anyone called the house anymore. Most people texted or used their cell phones, and the landline mostly collected dust. I answered on the third ring. Thomas Bennett? Speaking. This is Margaret Collins. Love my. I smiled despite everything. Margaret had been Grace's closest friend long before she'd become our family's attorney. She'd handled every legal matter we'd ever needed, but to us, she'd always been more than a lawyer. She'd been the person Grace trusted with conversations she didn't want to burden me with. It's good to hear your voice, Margaret. I wish it were under happier circumstances. Something in the way she said those words made me sit up straighter. Leave. Is everything all right? There was a brief pause before she answered. I believe it's time we met. What for? It's about Grace. The room suddenly felt very still. Margaret continued gently. She left very specific instructions for me many years ago. Until today, I hoped I'd never have to follow them. I tightened my grip on the phone. I'd rather explain them in person. When? Tomorrow morning. Another pause settled between us. Finally, she said the words that sent a chill through me. Thomas, your wife knew this day might come. The next morning arrived long before I felt ready for it. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams drifted between memories of Grace and the sound of Daniel's voice in the conference room, like in Tenbai. By 6 o'clock, already sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold without me noticing. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Grace had insisted on keeping even after it started losing a minute every few days. She always said imperfect things had more character. Looking around that empty kitchen, I wondered if she had known how much comfort those little imperfections would someday bring me. At 9 sharp, I pulled into the parking lot outside Margaret Collins's office. The building hadn't changed in years. It was a small brick office just off Main Street with flower boxes beneath every window, another idea Grace had talked Margaret into years ago. I sat in my truck for a moment before getting out, taking a deep breath that did little to settle my nerves. Margaret wasn't the type of person to make dramatic phone calls. If she'd said Grace expected this day to come, then she had meant every word. Margaret was already waiting when I stepped inside. Why? She walked around her desk and wrapped me in a warm hug before saying anything. It wasn't the greeting of an attorney meeting with a client. It was the embrace of someone who had watched two people build a life together and understood how deeply one of them was still missed. It's good to see you, Tom, she said softly. I wish the circumstances were different. So do I. She motioned for me to sit at a round table near the window instead of across from her desk. That small decision told me this wasn't going to feel like a legal meeting. It was going to feel personal. Margaret placed 2 cups of coffee on the table before taking a seat across from me. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Sunlight filtered through the window, warming the edge of the table where Grace had once sat beside me while signing paperwork after we'd expanded the shop almost 15 years earlier. I remembered teasing her for reading every page twice. You never know what people hide in the fine print. She'd laughed. At the time, I thought she was joking. Margaret folded her hands together and looked at me with the same calm expression Grace had always trusted. 7 years ago, about 3 months before Grace passed away, she asked me to prepare several legal documents. I nodded slowly. I remember you coming by the house a few times. There were reasons she didn't discuss all of them with you. I frowned slightly. Why wouldn't she tell me? Why? Because she believed telling you would change the way you lived. That answer only created more questions. Margaret reached beside her chair and carefully placed a small wooden box on the table. The box was made of walnut, polished until the grain almost shimmered beneath the light. I recognized it immediately. I made this, I whispered. You did. I ran my fingertips across the lid. Every corner, every tiny joint, every smooth edge carried the marks of my own hands. I'd built it one Christmas as a gift for Grace after she admired a similar keepsake box in an antique store. She had smiled when I gave it to her and told me it was more beautiful because it had been made with love instead of money. I haven't seen this since the week before she died, Margaret finished gently. I nodded. She asked me to keep it. Margaret slid the box toward me but didn't open it. Grace left very clear instructions. This box was never to be opened unless one condition was met. I could feel my heartbeat growing heavier. What condition? Margaret looked directly into my eyes. If your family ever began valuing the business more than the people who built it. The words hung in the air between us. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly remembering dozens of conversations Grace and I had shared over the years. Whenever the shop became busier than usual, she'd gently remind me not to miss birthdays because of overtime. She'd insist we close early on Christmas Eve, even when customers wanted last-minute deliveries. More than once, she'd said something that had seemed almost unnecessary at the time. Never let the shop become more important than the family, Tom. Back then, I always smiled and promised her it never would. Margaret quietly broke the silence. She loved Daniel deeply. I know. She was incredibly proud of the man he was becoming. I know that too. But she also noticed something long before anyone else did. I felt my stomach tighten. What did she notice? Margaret chose her next words carefully. She noticed that Daniel measured his own worth by achievement. Every promotion, every successful project, every compliment from a customer became proof that he mattered. Grace worried that one day success might become something he protected instead of something he shared. I stared out the window for several seconds. She never told me. Why? Because she hoped she was wrong. Margaret rested one hand gently on the wooden box. She believed people can grow beyond their fears if they're given the chance. She didn't want to plant suspicion between father and son. She wanted your relationship to grow naturally. I lowered my eyes to the box again. So why leave all this? Because she also believed wisdom means preparing for the possibility that hope isn't enough. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, Margaret unlocked the small brass latch. The lid opened with the same soft creak I remembered hearing years earlier. Inside lay a single cream-colored envelope, perfectly preserved despite the passing years. A name was written across the front in Grace's unmistakable handwriting. For Tom, only if love ever loses to money. My chest tightened so quickly I had to look away. I hadn't seen her handwriting in 7 years. It wasn't just ink on paper, it was her. For a moment, I could almost picture her sitting at our kitchen table, holding her favorite fountain pen, pausing every few sentences to think carefully before writing another word. She had always believed important things deserved to be written slowly. My fingers hovered over the envelope, but I couldn't bring myself to pick it up. I'm not sure I can do this, I admitted quietly. Margaret gave me a gentle smile. You don't have to read it today. I shook my head. No. I reached forward and carefully lifted the envelope into my hands. If Grace waited 7 years for me to read this, then I owe her the courage to begin. I slowly slid one finger beneath the seal, never imagining that the first few lines inside would reveal a truth my wife had carried silently for years. I stared at the envelope for what felt like several minutes before finally unfolding the letter inside. The paper was crisp, almost untouched by time, and the familiar slope of Grace's handwriting immediately pulled me back to evenings when she'd leave little notes in my lunchbox or reminders on the refrigerator. I had forgotten how comforting her handwriting was. It carried the same quiet confidence she always had, as if every word had been considered before it found its place on the page. The first line stopped me before I could continue. If you're reading this, my greatest hope has already failed. I swallowed hard and kept going. Tom, if this letter has reached your hands, it means our family has allowed success to become more important than the people who created it. I prayed that would never happen. I truly believed love would always win. But love, left unspoken, can sometimes be mistaken for obligation. My vision blurred for a moment. I lowered the letter and rubbed my eyes before looking back at the page. Grace had always known exactly how to say difficult things without making anyone feel attacked. Even now, she wasn't pointing fingers. She was simply telling the truth as she had always seen it. Before you blame yourself, I need you to remember something. You have spent your entire life giving. You gave up weekends. You gave up vacations. You gave up promotions at other companies that would have paid twice as much because they would have taken you away from home. You never told Daniel about those choices because you didn't want him to feel responsible for them. I froze. I had never told anyone about those job offers. Not even Daniel. Years ago, two larger furniture manufacturers had approached me with management positions. One would have required moving across the country. The other promised a salary I could hardly imagine at the time. Grace and I talked about them late into the night after Daniel had gone to bed. We needed the money, but both jobs would have meant 60-hour weeks, constant travel, and missing most of our son's childhood. When I turned them down, I never regretted it. At least I thought I hadn't. Margaret watched me quietly from across the table. I didn't know she remembered those conversations, I said softly. She remembered everything. I smiled through damp eyes. I continued reading. Daniel grew up believing the shop succeeded because you were strong. The truth is, it survived because you were willing to be ordinary every single day. You chose consistency over recognition. He saw the finished building, but he never saw the opportunities you quietly buried so he could grow up with both parents at home. The words settled deeply inside me because they weren't written to make me feel important. They were written because Grace wanted me to stop believing I had somehow failed. For the first time since leaving the conference room, I felt something besides sadness. I felt understood. The next page revealed another surprise. There is something else you never knew, Tom. I kept careful records not because I expected a fight, but because memory fades while paper does not. If our family ever reached this moment, I wanted the truth to have a voice louder than hurt feelings. Looked up at Margaret. What records? Instead of answering immediately, she reached into a leather folder beside her chair and carefully removed several sealed documents. Grace brought these to me over several years. There are more? She nodded. Loot. She asked me to safeguard them until the condition in her instructions had been met. I stared at the stack. Grace hadn't simply written one letter. She had prepared for this possibility with incredible care. Margaret slid the documents toward me, but kept one hand resting lightly on top. I'm not asking you to read these today. In fact, I don't think you should. Why not? Because the letter comes first. I frowned. Grace believed emotions should always come before evidence. That sounded exactly like my wife. When people are hurting, Margaret continued, facts alone rarely heal them. She wanted you to remember who you are before you learned everything she protected. I nodded slowly. That makes sense. It always did to her. I returned to the letter. Please don't become angry with Daniel. If he has reached this point, he isn't acting out of hatred. He's acting out of fear. He has spent his whole life trying to prove he deserves what he's been given. Fear has a way of convincing good people that they must stand alone. Don't mistake that fear for a lack of love. I lowered the page again. Even now, I whispered. Margaret finished my thought. She's still protecting him. I laughed softly through the tears gathering in my eyes. That's Grace, yes, always finding room for compassion. Margaret smiled. Lie. She loved both of you too much to let either one become the villain. Those words stayed with me. Until then, I had been replaying Daniel's sentence over and over in my mind, letting it define him. But Grace refused to let one terrible decision erase a lifetime of father and son. She wasn't excusing him. She was asking me to understand him. There was a difference. I turned another page. Tom, there is one final thing you must know before you decide what happens next. 7 years ago, I saw small changes that worried me. Nothing dramatic. Just little moments that reminded me how easily business can replace family if nobody is paying attention. That is why I asked Margaret to help me quietly protect something that belongs to you. Not because I expected you to use it, but because I hoped you would never need it. I stopped reading. My heart was beating faster again. I looked toward Margaret. What did she protect? Margaret took a slow breath. The answer to that question is inside the next document. She gently gathered the remaining papers into a neat stack. When you're ready, Tom, we'll go through them together. I looked down at Grace's letter resting in my hands, then at the sealed documents waiting beside it. For the second time in less than 24 hours, I found myself holding something that had the power to change everything I believed about my family. I still had no idea how much of my wife's quiet strength had remained hidden, even from me. I looked at the stack of documents for a long time without reaching for them. Grace had always believed that important decisions deserved patience, not urgency, and sitting there across from Margaret, I could almost hear her reminding me not to rush, simply because I was afraid of what came next. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope before resting both hands on the table. My heart had settled enough to think clearly again, but every answer seemed to uncover two more questions. Margaret waited until I looked up before speaking. There's something I need to explain before we open the next file. I nodded. Grace never intended these documents to become weapons. I didn't think she did. She was very clear about that. She wasn't trying to punish Daniel. She was trying to protect you if your kindness was ever mistaken for weakness. That sentence stayed with me because it described something I'd never considered. Why? I had always thought of kindness as its own reward. It had never occurred to me that kindness, left undefended, could someday be misunderstood. Margaret opened the leather folder and removed a single document, placing it between us without sliding it across the table. 7 years ago, when Grace came to see me, she asked one question before we talked about paperwork. What was it? Margaret smiled faintly. She asked, "Can you help me protect Tom without letting him know he's being protected?" I couldn't help smiling through the ache in my chest. That sounds exactly like her. I told her it depended on what she meant. And she said she wasn't worried about you making bad decisions. She was worried about what would happen if one day you stopped standing up for yourself. I looked down at my weathered hands. She always knew me too well. Margaret leaned back in her chair. She also knew Daniel. For the first time since arriving, there was a quiet firmness in her voice. She loved him deeply, Tom, never doubt that. But she noticed something after he began taking on more responsibility at the shop. I felt myself listening more carefully. What changed? He stopped celebrating people and started celebrating results. The words landed gently, but they carried weight. It wasn't obvious at first, Margaret continued. He became more focused, more driven, more ambitious. None of those things are bad by themselves. Grace admired his work ethic. What concerned her was how disappointment began affecting him. I frowned. What do you mean? When a project succeeded, he was confident. When something failed, he questioned his own worth. She realized he wasn't simply building a business. He was trying to prove something. I closed my eyes for a moment. That wasn't the Daniel I had intended to raise. As a little boy, he'd been happiest helping me sweep sawdust into piles taller than he was. He used to laugh every time I let him hammer bent nails into scrap boards, convinced he was building masterpieces. Back then, success had been measured in smiles, not profit margins. Why? Somewhere along the way, that had changed. I should have seen it, I whispered. Margaret shook her head immediately. No, I was his father. You were also running a growing business while caring for a wife whose health was slowly failing. Grace never blamed you for not seeing every small change. The mention of her illness brought back memories I hadn't visited in years. The hospital appointments, the medications lined up beside the kitchen sink. The nights when she insisted she felt fine, even though I could see the exhaustion behind her smile. During those years, the shop had survived because everyone carried a little more than their share. Daniel had taken on additional responsibility without being asked. I'd been proud of him for that. Maybe I had mistaken responsibility for emotional maturity. Margaret gently slid the document toward me. This is the first record Grace asked me to prepare. Across the top of the page were the words, Private Memorandum of Family Contributions. I looked at Margaret. What is this? It's something Grace began documenting after her diagnosis. I carefully turned the first page. It wasn't filled with legal language. It was a timeline, year by year, decision by decision. Each entry described something our family had quietly sacrificed for one another. The first page mentioned the year I'd declined the management position in Chicago because it would have required moving away while Daniel was entering high school. The next recorded the year Grace sold several pieces of inherited jewelry without telling anyone so we could purchase a new industrial planer instead of taking out another loan. I stared at the page. I never knew. Margaret nodded. She insisted those pieces meant less to her than keeping the business stable. My throat tightened. She told me the money came from better sales. I know, I shook my head slowly. Why wouldn't she tell me? Because she knew you'd try to replace them. That sounded exactly like Grace. I continued reading. Another entry described how Daniel had worked every summer through college instead of accepting unpaid internships elsewhere because he wanted to help the shop. That surprised me. He never told me he turned those opportunities down. Margaret smiled gently. He didn't want credit. For the first time all morning, I felt something unexpected. Relief. This wasn't a record of one person's sacrifices. It was a record of all of us. Each member of the family had quietly given up something for the others. Some sacrifices I knew, others had remained hidden for years. Grace hadn't created this timeline to prove who loved more. She'd created it so none of us would forget that love had always existed beneath the misunderstandings. I turned another page. The handwriting changed. Instead of Grace's neat script, there were photocopies of old receipts, bank statements, and handwritten notes she'd attached with short explanations. Everything had a purpose, everything connected. Mare had been carefully preserved so that one day emotion could be supported by truth. I looked up. She really thought this far ahead. Margaret gave a slow nod. She hoped none of us would ever need to open this folder. A silence settled between us again. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt respectful, as though Grace herself deserved those quiet moments. Finally, Margaret reached into the folder one last time. There is still one document I haven't shown you. I looked toward her. Why save it until now? Why? Because Grace instructed me that you shouldn't see it until after you remembered what kind of family you truly are. She placed a sealed cream-colored envelope beside the memorandum. Unlike the first letter, this one wasn't addressed only to me. Across the front, in Grace's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words. To be opened with Daniel present. I felt my pulse quicken. Whatever Grace had prepared next wasn't meant to separate a father from his son. It was meant to bring us to the same table, where neither of us could hide from the truth. The question wasn't whether Daniel had hurt me. He had. The real question was whether I was willing to believe Grace when she insisted that fear, not cruelty, had led him to that conference room. I wasn't ready to forgive him yet, but I also wasn't ready to let one terrible afternoon erase the son I'd spent a lifetime raising. Grace had asked me not to mistake his fear for a lack of love. As difficult as that felt, I owed her enough to try. I didn't go back to the shop the next morning. Instead, I wandered into the garage behind my house, where I'd kept a small workbench ever since retiring. It wasn't much compared to the shop, just a sturdy bench of ice and a few shelves filled with tools I'd collected over the years. My old carpenter's hammer rested exactly where I'd left it after cleaning it the night before. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, remembering the joke Grace used to make whenever she caught me staring at it. One day, that hammer will know more about this family than either of us. At the time, I'd laughed. Now I wondered if she had been right. I spent the morning repairing a rocking chair that belonged to my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. She was 83 years old and refused to throw anything away if it could still be fixed. Halfway through tightening the joints, she appeared at my garage carrying a plate of homemade oatmeal cookies. I thought I'd find you out here, she said with a smile. I guess old habits are hard to break. She looked around before her eyes settled on me. You've been quiet this week. I've had a lot on my mind. She didn't ask what had happened. People from her generation rarely pried into someone else's pain. Instead, she placed the cookies on the workbench and gently touched my arm. Sometimes the strongest wood develops cracks you can't see right away. Doesn't mean it can't be repaired. She smiled before heading back across the yard. I watched her go, thinking about how often life seemed determined to repeat the same lesson. Grace had spent years reminding me that broken things deserved patience. Now, without knowing anything about my family, Mrs. Henderson had said almost the same thing. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was Emily. Hi, Tom. Hi, Emily. I hope I'm not bothering you. Not at all. She hesitated for a moment. I was wondering if I could stop by. Of course. She arrived about 20 minutes later carrying a small casserole dish. I figured you probably weren't cooking much, she said with an embarrassed smile. You figured correctly. We sat on the back porch, overlooking the garden Grace had planted years earlier. The tomatoes were beginning to ripen. The lavender she'd insisted on growing still attracted butterflies every afternoon. Emily looked around the yard with quiet admiration. She loved this place. She did. I still miss talking to her. So do I. For a while, we spoke about ordinary things. Leaf. The weather, her work at the elementary school, a vacation she and Daniel had been planning before business became too busy. Eventually, the conversation slowed, and she wrapped both hands around her glass of iced tea. Daniel hasn't been sleeping. Looked at her. He told you? He told me enough. I didn't answer. He keeps saying he handled everything professionally, she continued, but he also keeps asking if he made a mistake. I leaned back in my chair. What do you think? Emily took a long breath. I think he spent so many years trying to prove he could lead the company that he forgot leadership isn't only about making difficult decisions. She looked down at the table before continuing. I don't think he realized he was asking his father to disappear. Those words hurt because they were true. I don't think he did either, I admitted. Emily looked relieved to hear me say it. I know you're hurting. I am, but I also know Daniel. So do I. He isn't celebrating any of this. I thought back to Grace's letter. Fear has a way of convincing good people that they must stand alone. Those words echoed through my mind again. Before Emily left, she reached into her purse and pulled out something wrapped carefully in a kitchen towel. I almost forgot. She handed it to me. I found this while cleaning one of the storage cabinets at the shop. I unwrapped the towel slowly. Inside was the old brass bell we'd hung beside the front entrance on opening day. Customers used to ring it whenever they picked up a completed custom order. Over the years, it had become a tradition. Children loved ringing it. Grace always insisted that every happy customer deserved to celebrate. I thought this was lost years ago. So did we. I turned the bell over in my hands. The brass had dulled with age, but the engraving on the side was still visible. Ask Bennett Woodworks. Built with family, my throat tightened. Grace had chosen those exact words. I thought you should have it, Emily said quietly. Thank you. After she drove away, I carried the bell into the house and placed it beside the old family photograph above the fireplace. Looking at them together, I had overlooked for years. In the photograph, Grace wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at Daniel. The smile on her face wasn't one of pride in the business. It was the smile of a mother watching her son become part of something bigger than himself. That evening, I took Grace's journal down from the bookshelf where it had sat untouched since her funeral. Margaret had mentioned it, but I had never found the courage to read it. The cover was worn from years of use, and tucked between the pages was a dried lavender flower that must have fallen from the garden. I opened to a random page. The entry wasn't about illness. It wasn't about business. It was about an ordinary Saturday nearly 15 years earlier. Grace had written about watching Daniel and me build a toy chest for a little girl whose family couldn't afford one. She described the way Daniel smiled when the child hugged him after we delivered it. Then, beneath that memory, Grace had written one sentence that made me close the journal for a moment. The day Tom and Daniel forget that this shop exists to serve people instead of impress them, they'll need each other more than they'll realize. I slowly opened the journal again, wondering how many more pieces of Grace's quiet wisdom were waiting inside, and whether they would finally be enough to bring my son and me back to the same side of the table. The next morning, I woke before the sun, just as I always had. For the first time in weeks, though, I didn't feel the familiar emptiness that had followed me since leaving the shop. The hurt was still there, but it no longer stood alone. Grace had somehow given it company. She had replaced anger with questions, and questions, I've learned, leave room for hope in ways anger never can. After breakfast, I called Margaret. I think I'm ready. I was hoping you'd say that, she replied. There was another envelope. There was, the one meant for Daniel and me. I've already contacted him. I paused. You have? Grace instructed me to do so after you finished reading her first letter. What did he say? He sounded confused. I imagine he did. He agreed to come this afternoon, then spent the next several hours walking through Grace's garden. She always claimed flowers taught patience better than people did. You could water them, protect them, and care for them every day, but they would still bloom only when they were ready. Standing among the lavender she'd planted years earlier, I wondered if families worked the same way. That afternoon, I arrived at Margaret's office 15 minutes early. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I simply needed a few quiet moments before seeing Daniel again. My last clear memory of him was standing inside that conference room, convinced he was making the right decision while unknowingly breaking his father's heart. Low-span. When the front door finally opened, I heard his footsteps before I saw him. He stopped the moment we made eye contact. Neither of us spoke, He looked exhausted. The confident businessman I'd seen every day at the shop had disappeared. His shirt was wrinkled, dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and his shoulders carried a weight that hadn't been there just a week earlier. "Hi, Dad." There was an awkward pause before he quietly asked, "How have you been?" I considered giving him the polite answer. Instead, I told him the truth. "I've had better weeks," he nodded slowly, I figured. Margaret invited us into the conference room she'd prepared. It wasn't large, but she'd arranged 3 comfortable chairs around a round table instead of using her formal meeting space. There were no legal pads, no stacks of contracts, and no computers. Only the sealed envelope rested in the center. None of us sat down immediately. Daniel looked at the envelope. "What's this?" Margaret answered gently. "Grace left it for both of you," he frowned. "My mom?" "Yes. I don't understand." "You will." We finally took our seats. Daniel looked at me once before lowering his eyes. "I'm sorry things happened the way they did." The apology sounded sincere, but it wasn't complete. He was apologizing for the pain. He still didn't fully understand the cause. "I know," I said quietly. Margaret waited until the room became still. "Before either of you reads this letter, there's something Grace insisted I tell you." She opened a folder and removed a single page written entirely in Grace's handwriting. She wrote these instructions separately because she believed they mattered just as much as the letter itself. Margaret began reading. "If you're sitting together today, I need one promise from both of you. Neither of you may interrupt the other after reading my words. Listen first. Defend yourselves later. Families survive because someone chooses understanding before being understood." Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. That sounded exactly like his mother. Margaret slid the envelope toward us. "This belongs to both of you." I looked at Daniel. "You should open it." His hands hesitated before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was another handwritten letter. This time, Daniel began reading aloud. He smiled faintly. "She used to call us that. I remember," he continued. "You always believed the shop was built from wood, tools, and hard work. You were both wrong. It was built from trust. Everything else came later." Leave. Daniel's voice became quieter. "Tom, you taught our son how to build furniture. Daniel, your father spent his entire life teaching you something much more important without realizing it. He showed you how to put family ahead of success." Why? Daniel stopped reading. He swallowed hard before continuing. "If you're reading this together, then somewhere along the way, success has convinced one of you that people can be managed like projects. They cannot." The room was completely silent. "Daniel, if you're the reason this letter was opened, I need you to answer one question honestly. When did your father become an obstacle instead of the man you admired?" Daniel lowered the letter. He couldn't continue. His eyes filled with tears as he stared at the page. He whispered. "I don't know." No one spoke. After a long moment, he looked at me. "I don't know when it happened." His voice broke. "I kept thinking I had to prove I deserved the business." "You already did," I answered softly. I didn't believe that. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Every time someone complimented you instead of me, every time a customer asked for you, I felt like I was still 12 years old trying to earn my place. For the first time since everything had happened, I truly saw my son instead of my pain. He hadn't wanted to erase me. He'd been terrified of never becoming enough." Margaret quietly placed Grace's journal on the table. "I think there's one more thing both of you should see." She opened it to a page marked years earlier with a ribbon. Grace had written, "The day Daniel finally understands that his father's shadow isn't hiding him but protecting him, our family will finally be free." Daniel covered his face with both hands. "I never understood. I know. Thought stepping out of your shadow meant pushing you aside." I reached across the table and rested my hand on his shoulder. "No, son." He looked up. "It meant walking beside me until you were ready to walk on your own." He began crying without trying to hide it. For several minutes, no one said another word. Sometimes silence is the only language honest enough for the moment. When Daniel finally composed himself, he reached into his briefcase and carefully removed a ring of keys. Resting on top was the old brass shop key I'd carried for decades before handing it to him when he became president of the company. He slid it across the table. "I don't deserve to keep this." Looked at the worn key, then gently pushed it back toward him. "No." He looked confused. "You do." His eyes widened, "But after today," I said quietly, "you're going to carry it for a very different reason." Looked at the worn brass key resting between us, then back at my son. For years, I had imagined this moment very differently. If someone had asked me a month earlier how I would react after hearing the words he'd spoken in that conference room, I probably would have said I didn't know. Now I did. Grace had been right all along. The easiest thing in the world would have been to make Daniel carry the weight of his mistake forever. A harder choice, the one she had quietly prepared both of us for, was helping him become the man she always believed he could be. You keep it, I said again. He shook his head. Dad, after everything I've done, after everything you've learned. He looked at me with tears still in his eyes. There's a difference. Margaret remained silent. She knew this wasn't her conversation anymore. Her role had never been to solve our family. It had been to protect Grace's final wishes until the right moment arrived. Daniel held the key in his hand for several seconds before speaking again. I don't know how to fix this. I smiled gently. Neither do I. He looked surprised. Life. I thought you'd know. I've built a lot of furniture in my life, son. Families are much harder. For the first time in weeks, a small laugh escaped both of us. It lasted only a moment, but it reminded me of something important. Why? Even after everything that had happened, we still recognized each other. Margaret reached into the folder one final time. There's one last document. She carefully placed the original deed for Bennett Woodworks on the table. Daniel frowned. I've seen copies of this. You've seen the updated business records, Margaret replied. You haven't seen the original agreements. She opened the document and pointed to a section near the bottom. Grace asked me to prepare this amendment shortly after her diagnosis. Daniel leaned closer. I did the same. The amendment stated that while Daniel would assume operational leadership of the company, the founding principles of Bennett Woodworks could never be changed without the unanimous agreement of both generations of the Bennett family while Thomas Bennett was living. What does that mean? Daniel asked. Margaret smiled. It means your mother never wanted the business protected only by ownership. She paused. She wanted it protected by its values. Daniel continued reading. There, beneath the legal language, Grace had insisted on adding a simple statement. This business exists to serve families before profit, people before pride, and character before growth. I couldn't help smiling. She actually convinced you to put that into a legal document? Margaret laughed softly. You knew, Grace. I did. I argued that it wasn't standard legal language. She told me not every family deserved a standard agreement. Daniel slowly closed the document. So none of this was about taking the company away from me. Margaret shook her head. Never. It was about making sure I never forgot why it existed. Exactly. Daniel covered his eyes for a moment. I spent months preparing presentations for consultants. He laughed bitterly. My mother solved the biggest problem in one sentence. A quiet peace settled over the room, not because everything had been repaired, because we finally knew where to begin. 2 days later, Daniel asked if I would meet him at the shop before the employees arrived. I wasn't sure what to expect. When I pulled into the parking lot just after sunrise, every light inside the building was already on. Daniel stood waiting near the front entrance. He didn't say much. He simply opened the door and motioned for me to walk in first. The shop smelled exactly as it always had. Fresh lumber, coffee, sawdust, home. As we reached the center of the workshop, I noticed every employee had gathered there. Mike Lewis, Emily, the office staff, the apprentices, everyone. No machines were running. No one was working. Daniel stepped forward. I asked everyone to come early because I owe all of you something. The room became perfectly still. He looked at me before turning back to the employees. Last week, I made the worst decision of my career. No one interrupted. I thought leadership meant proving I could stand on my own. I forgot that everything standing behind me is the reason I was able to stand at all. He walked over until he was standing beside me instead of in front of me. I told my father he wasn't needed anymore. Several employees lowered their eyes. I was wrong. He looked directly at me. This company exists because one man quietly spent 40 years putting other people ahead of himself. His voice became steadier. I thought I inherited a business. He shook his head. I inherited an example. Without another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the retirement plaque he'd tried to give me days earlier. He held it for a moment before setting it aside. I had this made because I thought my father's work was finished. Then he picked up another wooden plaque resting on a nearby table. This one was different, handmade, Sybil, built from walnut. Across the front were words carved by hand. Founder, mentor, father. Underneath in smaller letters, asterisk, your greatest work was never the shop. It was the people inside it. I couldn't speak. Daniel handed it to me with both hands. I hope one day I've earned the right to be remembered the same way. I wrapped my arms around my son. Neither of us cared who saw the tears. When we finally stepped apart, Mike cleared his throat. I think somebody's forgotten something. He pointed toward the front entrance. Emily smiled and disappeared for a moment before returning with the old brass bell she'd found in storage. She handed it to me. I think this belongs back where it started. Together, Daniel and I walked to the entrance. He held the ladder. I fastened the bell above the door. When I climbed down, Daniel looked at me.
Would you do the honors?
I smiled. No. I placed the rope in his hand. We'll do it together. We pulled it at the same time. The clear sound echoed through the workshop, just as it had on opening day 40 years earlier. For a brief moment, I could almost see Grace standing near the front counter with sawdust on her sleeve, smiling that quiet smile she always wore whenever our family remembered what truly mattered. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that day. Daniel and I still disagreed sometimes. The business still faced challenges. There were difficult months, unexpected expenses, and moments when old habits tried to return. But something fundamental had changed. We stopped measuring success only by contracts signed or profits earned. Every Monday morning began with coffee around the old workbench instead of closed office doors. Birthdays were celebrated again. We closed early on Christmas Eve, just as Grace had always insisted. When a young apprentice made a mistake, we taught instead of criticized. Slowly, almost without noticing, the shop began to feel like home again. I never returned as the man making every decision. That wasn't the future Grace wanted. Instead, I became what she had quietly prepared me to become. A mentor. A steady voice, a reminder of why the business existed in the first place. Sometimes customers still ask if I'm the owner. I smile and point toward Daniel. He's leading things now. And I mean it not because he replaced me. Because he finally understood that leadership isn't about stepping out of someone's shadow. It's about carrying their light forward. The old family photograph still sits above my fireplace. Beside it rests Grace's keepsake box, her journal, my worn carpenter's hammer, and the little brass bell that once welcomed every customer through our front door. Whenever my grandchildren visit, they always ask why I keep those old things instead of buying new ones. I tell them the same answer I gave Grace all those years ago. Then I tell them something she taught all of us, a lesson no business plan could ever contain. The strongest families aren't the ones that never break. They're the ones that choose again and again to repair what love built before pride tears it apart. And every time I hear that bell ring above the shop door, I smile because it reminds me that the greatest inheritance a father can leave behind isn't a business. It's a family that remembers why it was built.